Good morning. In the last few entries, I've presented some of the ways that Mathew Franklin Whittier would use what I call code, which is to say embedding secret messages by inference or style or various methods into his written works. And I've also presented what I believe to be a little novel co-authored by Matthew and Abby about 4 years before they would have co-authored A Christmas Carol. So that also is relevant. It's not getting as many views, but these are all clues that all come together, Before I get started, I wanted to mention that my interview with Thanatos TV online now has passed the 10,000 view mark. And it's got quite a number of comments there, mostly positive. So it's not that I have no reach at all, but this apparently, even with 10,000 views, there's only been maybe one book sale and nobody has tried to contact me, and I've had no invitations, to be interviewed or anything else. So it means that at least to people who are interested in these topics, I'm interesting, but maybe too much of a hot potato, or I don't know. I don't really understand why I continue to be a pariah, even though I'm actually outstripping people like Dr. Jim Tucker and Carol Bowman, who were interviewed before me, but they haven't hit 10,000 yet. So I don't know, maybe I'm just kind of a strange, controversial figure that's interesting, but nobody actually wants to talk to me, Anyway, what I'm going to do today is to go into something that's in my paper, and the one that I've already posted and published. And this is called Evidence That A Christmas Carol Was Originally Written by Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier, rather than by Charles Dickens. If you want to read this paper, you can get into the updates page on my website and you'll find the download link there. And this particular bit of evidence is actually not the strongest, and I put it towards the end of the paper. This is like a 49-page paper. Very few people apparently have read the entire paper. So of the 15 or so people that watch this blog, I'm guessing none of them, or very few of them, have actually seen this evidence because they haven't bothered to read the entire paper and they haven't gotten to this part. So that's why I'm doing an entry today, because I don't think anybody's seen this. I can't assume they've seen it, which I was doing. So we're going to see how Mathew used this same kind of code that I've demonstrated was real and not just my imagination, how he used it as regards A Christmas Carol. But first I have to set the stage a little bit, because when he uses this kind of code to comment on Edgar Allan Poe's theft of the raven from him, it's very different, because he didn't give permission for Poe to claim the raven. It was an out-and-out theft, and he wasn't in a position to do anything about it. He couldn't go public because of his anti-slavery activities, and later on he couldn't go public because nobody would have believed him. In the case of Dickens, it was different, because Mathew was a longtime fan of Charles Dickens, which I can prove by his letters to his brother, and he must have voluntarily handed over the manuscript for A Christmas Carol after Abby's death to Dickens in Boston in January of 1842, when Dickens visited Boston. And this is a no-brainer, because Mathew had long been a personal friend of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was instrumental in arranging the welcome dinner for Dickens. So definitely he would have had a personal introduction. Plus, in Dickens' letters, there is an acknowledgement of a letter from Mathew, so we know that Mathew wrote him. So there's no question in my mind that they would have met, and in that meeting or subsequently, Mathew would have handed over to him the manuscript that he and Abby had worked on before her passing in 1841. So who knows what Mathew told him, because he was in deep grief and he wanted Abby's work to get exposure, and he was fooled by Dickens. He believed that Dickens was a man of good character, of exemplary character, who was doing good work for social reform, none of which I think was true, actually. I think Dickens was a big hypocrite. But Matthew was fooled by him, as was typical for Matthew. He was fooled by a lot of people. He was very gullible. And he handed this manuscript over. He may have said, do with it what you like, or something to that effect. We don't know that. But probably he would have felt initially very pleased that Dickens saw fit to use his manuscript, his and Abby's manuscript. As the years rolled on, there was a cynical side of him that began to suspect that Dickens was not what he pretended to be, that a lot of his best works were plagiarized, that he was not a man of good character. Actually, he was a sensationalist and not really a spiritual or even philanthropic writer, sincerely. And yet he couldn't quite bring himself to believe it. So he was, I would say, he was vacillating. He was on the fence about this. In his darker moments, he thought maybe Dickens took advantage of him, which he totally did. And at other times, he thought that Dickens was a literary hero and the greatest living author, at that time in the world, and that he was privileged that Dickens saw fit to use his manuscript. So it so happens that when Dickens came to America the second time in 1867 and gave readings, he would prominently feature A Christmas Carol in those readings. And Matthew managed to secure a seat in the nosebleed section, not in Boston or Portland, but in New York City. He finally managed to get a ticket in New York City. And he wrote about it. He wrote a review of it in the Portland Transcript with his accustomed secret signature, a star, a single asterisk or a star. This is exactly the same writer who was writing as the star in the New York Tribune in 1844 to 46, whom historians believe was Margaret Fuller. It was never Margaret Fuller. She was the literary editor, and occasionally she put her thumb in, I think, or constrained what Matthew could say. And then she started occasionally writing one or two of her own toward the end. And then she retained that signature, quote unquote, because it was never really hers, when she went to Europe and began writing as the foreign correspondent. But all that's going to be in another article that I'm publishing later on this year. But this review in the Portland Transcript, signed with a star, was definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. I can prove it 100 times over. Matthew used the star. The very first time was in 1830. He continued using it until 1873. The first time he used it in the Portland Transcript was 1838. So here we are on the January 4, 1868 edition, dated December 20, 1867 in New York. So he's actually writing this on December 20th, but this gets published in the January 4, 1868 edition the following year. Now, I won't read the whole article, I think, but let's just get right to the code, except that we want to just keep in mind that Matthew is still on the fence. He's still vacillating. Some part of him deep down says, Dickens took advantage of me. He's not a spiritual man at all. And some part of him still considers Dickens a great author. So this comes through pretty clearly. But what he's definitely going to do, he's definitely going to leave posterity some mention that he and Abby were the original authors. Okay, so definitely we're going to see that, and we're going to see vacillation on the other points. So first of all, we have to establish that Matthew was, in fact, in the nosebleed section here. So he says, the, quote, light aerial gallery in which we were glad to get seats was very lofty and, were you ever up in a balloon, extremely ethereal. So keep in mind, he's up there and he can't see very well. So when we get to where he later on talks about Dickens' expression, we know that he really couldn't have seen it himself. See, apparently there was quite a bit of criticism of Dickens. For example, Louisa May Alcott, when she went to see Dickens in London, I think it was, she was very disappointed in him personally. You know, she thought he was crass, basically. with all the rings and the fancy coat and his manner and everything. She was very disappointed, disillusioned, I would say. And other people were beginning to get this impression also. I think the question of his affair with Ellen Ternan had come out, but he had, in a grandiose way, denied it, and people were kind of on the fence about that. But I think he was beginning to get a little bit of a bad rep. So Matthew defends him, see? So he says, "For myself, I anticipated these readings with most intense interest. From the day I first read David Copperfield down to the era of R. Wilfer and his vivacious daughters, I have felt, and so have thousands for that matter, a sort of personal attachment and obligation to Dickens." Well, that's code in itself, because his personal attachment and obligation came from the fact that Dickens published A Christmas Carol for him, and not from these other things. See, so that right there is code. I mean, you could take it or leave it, but I'm telling you, knowing the way Matthew did these things, that phrase, see, when you see a phrase that's out of context, that isn't quite supported by the evidence he's giving or the references he's giving, you see any phrase that just seems to hang there by itself and doesn't quite seem to fit, that's generally code, because it's referring to something else. See, so because his appreciation of David Copperfield and R. Wilfer doesn't make a sort of personal attachment and obligation. That's much heavier, more specific language that is justified by an appreciation of any particular work, see? And you're meant to take it, in a fanciful kind of way, but it's not fanciful. It's a specific reference. It's a hidden reference to something concrete. Does that make sense? I'm trying to explain it in the most articulate way I can here in front of the camera with like 5 hours sleep. All right, so we know that he's up in the nosebleed section. Now, let me read this whole paragraph because it's relevant. "The light aerial gallery in which we were glad to get seats was very lofty and, were you ever up in a balloon, extremely ethereal. On its inmost verge we waited. I need not tell you how Dickens steps or what sorts of clothes and jewelry he wears, because there have been comments on this. All that has been reiterated and is perhaps, quote, really of no consequence to most of us." So he's defending Dickens. "Having read in a Boston letter that the enunciation of the first sentence of the carol assured his success in Boston, we were dismayed at perceiving nothing remarkable in that half-dozen words." Now, the first half-dozen words of A Christmas Carol are, "Marley was dead," to begin with. That's 6 words. That's what he's referring to. That's the statement of faith. That's the statement of Matthew and Abby's faith in the other world, in the fact that they are talking about a real paranormal event, okay? So Matthew did not feel the authenticity in those first 6 words, which means that he's beginning to suspect that Dickens is a skeptic and never really was a spiritual person who had a real faith in the other world to begin with. Okay, so he said a mouthful there. But when the reader came to the paragraph, "Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone was Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, clutching, covetous old sinner," we knew who it was that spoke. That means that in Matthew's perception, the description of Scrooge is what Dickens really warmed to and really resonated with, which means he's beginning to suspect that that is Dickens' actual personal character. In other words, Dickens is Scrooge. He's not the believer in the other world. Now, "There's no other man in the world who can write as Dickens does, and now surely there's nobody who can read like him." Okay, listen to the first one again. "There's no other man in the world who can write as Dickens does." Now, we've seen this before. It's a neutral statement. It's not a statement of praise. There's no value in it. It's just a statement of fact. There's no other man in the world who can write as Dickens does. If I'm not mistaken, what he means is, in A Christmas Carol, 90% of that is not Dickens. Because he doesn't write like that. you know, only where he has modified it. That's Dickens. So, and you can tell because just like everybody else in the world, there's no other man in the world who can write as Dickens does. So this is code. And this is one of Matthew's techniques um, to speak in neutral language, which is really a disparagement because he's apparently inferring praise, but it isn't praise. If he meant to praise Dickens, that nobody writes as well as Dickens does, he would have said that. See, knowing Matthew's style, if he had meant that, he would have said that. The fact that he gives us a neutral statement, there's no other man in the world who can write as Dickens does, that's code. Now we get into the meat of the thing because I have demonstrated, not just theorized, I've demonstrated that one of the techniques Matthew would use in his code is to give you a quote, and then the real message only comes when you look up the quote and you look at what happened before or what comes after that particular quote, usually poetry. Okay, it's in the context of the original quote, and you have to look it up to see what his real message is. He does that here. And this is why I did this entry today, because when I gave you proof that Matthew would use that technique, and it comes in again with Margaret Fuller, big time, I just realized probably none of you have actually read the end of my article and seen this evidence. Okay, so we've already seen that Matthew would in fact use this technique. Now watch him use it here with regard to Dickens. We recall, this is kind of totally out of context again. Remember, when Matthew says anything that's out of context, it means something in his private context. So he just said, and now surely there's nobody who can read like him, which is not necessarily positive either. We recalled our first perusal of the book and beheld, quote, another morn risen on mid-noon. And he goes on, Fezziwig's ball was admirably managed and was a complete success. In came, quote, Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast animated smile. The story of the Christmas dinner at the Cratchits was delightfully told, and nothing in mimic life could be more pathetic than the expression of Bob Cratchit when he exclaims, my little child, my little child. Okay, we're going to go back and deconstruct this. Keep in mind, he says, and nothing in mimic life could be more pathetic. Recall that regarding Poe and the Ultima Thule portrait, which he had of Poe, he called it a counterfeit presentment. So here he talks about nothing in mimic life. That's meaningful. We're going to go back to that. So let's start. This is a chock full of messages here. He says, we recalled our first perusal of the book. Well, what he means is the first time he laid hands on Dickens' published edition of the book, which may have been 1844, which is the year of the one that I've got. I don't know if any made their way to America during 1843 or not. He would have grabbed one as soon as he could have. So what he's talking about is when he first held Dickens' published copy of the book. So then he quotes that he beheld another morn risen on mid-noon. What it looks like as though he was just so thrilled to see this wonderful book that it was like the sun rising in the morning. You know, that's what you're supposed to think. That's the surface, superficial layer. But this is code. So I looked it up. And again, thank goodness, I do have the internet. And let's see, I have to find the right piece of paper here. So I wouldn't have known this because, again, I don't have Mathew Franklin Whittier's deep scholarship, but I have the internet. So the line, another morn risen on mid-noon, comes from a portion of William Wordsworth's poem, The Prelude, or Growth of a Poet's Mind, and this part is entitled Cambridge and the Alps. And I'm going to read you the relevant excerpt here as I quoted it in my paper. That streamlet, whose blue current works its way between romantic Dovedale's spiry rocks, pried into Yorkshire dales or hidden tracts of my own native region, and was blessed between these sundry wanderings with a joy above all joys that seemed another morn risen on mid-noon. Now, none of that seems relevant, does it? But now check this out. Blessed with the presence, friend, of that sole sister, her who hath been long dear to thee also, thy true friend and mine, now, after separation desolate, restored to me, such absence that she seemed a gift then first bestowed. I don't think I need to beat this one to death. I think it's obvious. What he means is that seeing this book again, holding it in his hands, the published version, was like Abby coming back to him because she had died. This is probably early 1844. She had died in March of 1841, like 3 years earlier. And it's as though Abby has come back to him in the person of this book that they worked on together. See, this is not my imagination. This is clear. People in denial might argue with me, but anybody who's not in denial should be able to see this immediately. So let me read the second half of this. Above all joys that seemed another morn risen on mid-noon, blessed with the presence, friend, of that sole sister, her who hath been long dear to thee also, thy true friend and mine, now, after separation desolate, restored to me, such absence that she seemed a gift then first bestowed. Okay, so Abby is the sole sister, dear to him, who had been restored to him after a separation desolate. This clarification appears immediately after the line that he quotes. There's no question that that's what he's doing. So Matthew has signed A Christmas Carol for himself and Abby. And primarily for Abby. He's really keeping himself out of the picture. He has signed this for Abby Poyen Whittier. There's no question about this. And you put this with all the other evidence. As I said, this was actually the weakest evidence that I had, so I put it at the end. And this is drivel. Somebody said that my paper was drivel. He claimed he read the whole thing and called it drivel. This is drivel, you know? I mean, come on. All right, so let's go back a little bit because there's more in here. Fezziwig's ball was admirably managed and was a complete success. This, of course, Matthew probably wrote that. I think that Fezziwig was probably patterned after Joseph T. Buckingham, one of Matthew's early editors, but I could be wrong about that. Anyway, that was something I think Matthew probably wrote. He says, in came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast animated smile. The story of the Christmas dinner at the Cratchits was delightfully told. That would have been Abby's portion, I believe. And nothing in mimic life could be more pathetic than the expression of Bob Cratchit when he exclaims, my little child, my little child. Now, first of all, note that he's not praising Dickens' rendition of it. He's saying nothing could be more pathetic than what's in the book, okay? And then when he says mimic life, what he means here is that this was written based on his own life. It was autobiographical, and it had to do with the loss of his 11-month-old son, Joseph, in 1838, right before they started writing A Christmas Carol. In other words, Matthew and Abby started writing A Christmas Carol partly as a result of their son's death. That was one of the big motivating factors for writing this story in the first place. So this is a tribute actually to his son, Joseph. Mimic life means that this mimics real life for him personally. See? So then we come down and he says, Mr. Dickens' power of facial expression is wonderful. But how would he know? Because he's told us the light aerial gallery in which we were glad to get seats was very lofty. He couldn't see Dickens' expression from up there. So how does he know? It's because he still wants to believe in the Dickens that he's believed in for many years, even though deep down he knows that he's been fooled. See? And then he defends Dickens against, they're still attacking Dickens for the way that he attacked America in American Notes, and Matthew is defending him on that count. And that's the way he closes this out. And there's your asterisk. I'll put it up on the screen so you can see that it's not just a little blob. There have been occasions where I've looked at a kind of a fuzzy copy and there's like a fly speck on there, and I thought that was an asterisk, and I've actually asked the museum, one of the libraries, will you tell me, is that an asterisk or is that a blob? And no, it's just a speck. See, well, this is not just a speck. This is definitely Matthew's asterisk. There's probably a lot more in this review. There's things that I maybe haven't even caught. There's references that other people would catch who are more familiar with Dickens. But I know Matthew's methods of using code, and he's used 2 or 3 of them in here, at least 3. When he talks about the first half dozen words of A Christmas Carol, Marley was dead to begin with, and says that he wasn't impressed with Dickens' authenticity when he read that, but that he was impressed with the authenticity of his reading of Scrooge. That's a clue. When he says there's no other man in the world who can write as Dickens does, and he's using neutral language, that's a clue. When he writes about Bob Cratchit saying, my little child, and mimic life, that's a clue. And when he quotes another morn risen on mid-noon in the context of first seeing A Christmas Carol, that's the clincher, because there he's using his technique of quoting a line of poetry, and then you look it up, and in the context, it's the portion directly above or directly below that contains the message. He's used that technique as well. So what do we got? 4 coded messages in this review. You're going to see a lot more of this if you read my article about Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven and Mathew Franklin Whittier's real authorship of it, because he took out all the stops when it came to Poe. He left nothing to chance as far as posterity was concerned. If anybody found him and found his works like I've done and learned to read his code, he made it absolutely certain that people would see that he was telling us in no uncertain terms that he had written The Raven and Edgar Allan Poe had no claim to it whatsoever. You'll see that in my upcoming article. And I'm aware that I'm being very passionate about this. This is what happens when you're ignored. You get stronger and stronger for being ignored, not weaker and weaker. See, I try harder and I get more forceful, and I'm more persuasive as time goes on, the longer that people ignore me. Well, they're not really ignoring me, because 10,000 people have watched my Thanatos TV interview. It's a good interview, by the way. It's one of the best I ever gave. And there's another one that's got like 8,000 or 9,000 that I gave about a month earlier. So I am reaching people. It's just they're not reaching back for whatever reason. I think out of maybe 1,800 views with those 2 interviews combined, there was 1 book sale. Well, now I don't have an agent. I don't have anybody pushing me. I don't have any advertising budget. But that's pretty bad, 1,800 in 1 sale. And the book is very easy to find, And on these entries, as you can see, I get between 4 and 15 views. This is like a world-class discovery. And I can only, in the internet, and people, put up, the Great Dane cuddling with the kitten, and you get like, 1 million views or whatever. And I can only get between 4 and 15. It's pretty strange. Okay, well, we passed the half-hour mark. That's all I'm going to do for today. I got a little bit of editing to do. Unfortunately, the only visual copies I have of this star-signed article are from microfilm, which I photographed the microfilm because I can't afford to print them. So I photographed them, which is free. That's because I'm totally shunned, so I'm poor and I have to make do. But anyway, I've cleaned them up in Photoshop Elements, which program cost me about $20, being an old edition. I've cleaned them up, and I'll put them on the screen where it's relevant here for this. And I hope you have a good day, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this.